Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome. Welcome to the 23rd Geneva Security Debate. Each month, we unite here leading thinkers and practitioners for interactive discussions. In the short run, we hope that these Geneva Security Debates will inform our policymakers here in Geneva and beyond with new insights, with joint reflections, and with networking opportunities. In the long run, we hope that these debates will help us to shape a better global future together. Today, we welcome you to the launch of the book Death Dust. Death Dust is a groundbreaking work that describes the rise, decline, and future of radiological weapons. And two of the four authors of the book are here with us today to describe its findings, Bill Potter and Hannah Notte. Welcome to both of you. It is a great honor to have you here with us. Before we go any further, I would also like to thank the US mission for generously supporting our event, and I would like to welcome you, my dear colleague and friend, Ambassador Bruce Turner, who is representing here the US mission. Thanks for this successful joint venture. Today, we gather not only to celebrate the product of meticulous research, but to shine a spotlight on a chapter often overshadowed in the annals of history, the development of radiological weapons. The quest for arms control has been an enduring odyssey, marked by the collective realization that our shared destiny hinges on the responsible stewardship of the destructive potential we wield. Bill Potter and Hannah Notte have masterfully navigated through this historical landscape, unveiling a series of case studies on radiological weapons that include the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, Iraq, and Egypt. The book describes the historical drivers that led these four countries to explore military innovation due to the real and to perceived threats from adversaries. In a world grappling with the complexities of nuclear technology and radiological hazards, understanding the historical context is, I believe, not a luxury, but it's a necessity. The book provides us with a compass, guiding us through the many historical lessons provided throughout about how radiological weapons were considered an important strategic enabler in conflict and war. I extend my heartfelt congratulations to both authors present here, Hannah and Bill, for their invaluable contributions to our understanding of arms control. And as we begin this book launch, let us not only appreciate the scholarship of the book, but also recognize the collective responsibility it imparts. This book launch underscores the importance that we remain vigilant custodians of our own shared global security. It's a call to action, urging us to reflect on the past, comprehend the present, and navigate the future with new wisdom and with renewed cooperation. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Christina Liang. She will introduce the speakers and she will chair this session. Thanks again for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Greminger, Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to see so many of you here for this very timely book launch. Indeed, as the director has just underlined, the world is grappling with the complexities of nuclear technology and radiological hazards, and understanding the historical context is not a luxury, but indeed a necessity. The new Oppenheimer film has underscored the importance of the development of the atomic bomb. It serves as a powerful reminder to consider the potential ramifications of our decisions, policies, and inventions. Today, we will not speak about the bomb, but the more easy to manufacture but devastatingly lethal radiological munitions, whose use would not discriminate between militaries and civilian targets. Two of the authors of the book are here with us today, and they will tell us about the story, history, and also potential future scenarios of radiological weapons. Dr. William Potter, to my left, is the director of the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar, professor of Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. He's a trained Soviet specialist and wrote the first book on technology, economics, and politics of nuclear non-proliferation. He was also one of the first scholars who had a great knowledge about Soviet affairs and the changes of nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union collapsed. He shared that knowledge and his interest in open source data collection, and he helped build what soon became one of the largest training centers on curtailing the spread of weapons of mass destruction in the world, the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, CNS. Dr. Hannah Notte is the director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies and a senior associate at the CSIS in DC. Dr. Notte joined CNS in 2020 and worked for the European branch of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. She also worked for the NGO Shaikh Group and was the visiting researcher at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Carnegie Moscow Center. Thank you both for coming. I know for some of you it's been a very long trip, and I'm very thrilled to have you both here for this very important event. So for my first question, let me begin our discussion. So could you kindly tell me, Dr. Potter, what are the origins of your book, and how do you define radiological weapons, and what is your primary level of analysis, and what was your methodology in the book? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I was mesmerized, and I would have enjoyed hearing you continue to describe the book. But yes, that's my task and Hannah's now. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. And Bruce, thank you so much also for the luncheon. So this is an instance where I can point with great specificity to the origins of this particular study, which took me something like 9 years to produce, with tremendous assistance from some of my colleagues. But the impetus for the book actually can be traced to a talk that one of my Russian colleagues, Anton Khlopkov, gave at Wilton Park at the so-called Christmas Non-Proliferation gathering in December of 2013. And he was giving a presentation which focused on the DPRK. And he had a slide which showed a number of North Korean soldiers with chest packs with the yellow and black symbol of radioactivity emblazoned on the sacks. And there was an interesting discussion, but it didn't really focus on radiological weapons. But that evening, in my room, which used to be a stable, and it was very cold, and I wasn't sleeping very well. And so I started reflecting upon the talk, and it occurred to me that perhaps what the North Korean soldiers might be carrying, or what they may have wished to convey that they were carrying, were not small nuclear weapons, but perhaps radiological weapons. And I think it was one of the things that I found intriguing at that moment in time, having written a number of books and articles on non-state actors, terrorists, and so-called dirty bombs. I was really unaware of any study that dealt with radiological weapons, that is essentially dirty bombs that were developed by nation states. And so I was kind of intrigued with the notion. When I got back to Monterey, I talked with my colleague Jeffrey Lewis, who is far more of a DPRK expert than am I, and we both decided it made sense to kind of explore further the issue. And in the course of our research, which we ended up publishing in a short piece in Foreign Policy in 2014, much to our surprise, we came across interesting materials which depicted efforts by the United States to explore and then subsequently to develop and actually test radiological weapons. And there were references also to British interest in this domain. But it was striking how little there really was on the subject, particularly on non-US programs. And so two of my former students and I decided that we would explore the issue further, and we produced a fairly lengthy article which was published in the journal International Security in the fall, if I'm not mistaken, of 2020. And subsequently, I decided there really was enough there with respect to several other countries that we should pursue a book. But one of our difficulties was that none of that cadre were really proficient in Arabic. And so we brought on board Hananote. And so we decided to have 5 case studies. The US and the Soviet Union, the UK, and then we added Iraq and Egypt, and Hannah will say more about those later. So that's the answer to the first part of your question. You also asked about the methodology, and I've already kind of implied that we are focusing on state actors rather than non-state actors. Not to suggest that non-state actors are no longer an appropriate subject for examination, and a number of people, myself included, have invested a lot of time looking at non-state actor motivations and capabilities. But the topic of state actors in radiological weapons was really virgin territory, and is, for the most part, our volume aside, also the case. So we're talking about, when we're talking about radiological weapons, we're talking about the dispersal of nuclear material by means other than a nuclear explosive, basically by conventional means. The last point that I'll make here with respect to methodology is that while our focus is not particularly theoretical in its orientation, we employ what in the political science and international relations literature is known as structured focus comparison. It was pioneered by a very distinguished Stanford professor, Alexander George. And basically it involves asking the same question across different cases so that you're hopefully at the end of the day in a position to generalize some of your findings. So that's essentially what we did by way of the methodological approach.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. In your book, you describe the importance of adopting new weapons systems to understand the differences between innovation, invention, and diffusion. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. So people often use these terms interchangeably, but I think that's not desirable when you're talking about the question of radiological weapons. So when we're talking about invention, we're really talking about the process by which an idea or a concept is conceived. That's the invention side of the coin. When you're talking about innovation, we're interested in the process by which an invention is translated into some tangible product. It might be a weapon system in a military. And when we're talking about diffusion, we're talking about the process by which an idea or a product spreads from one party to another. It could be one organization or one country to another country. The distinction, and it's also important to see that the invention is the first phase, that innovation presumably would be the second, but it doesn't presuppose diffusion. And these distinctions are important because what we find across all 5 of the cases that we look at is that in no instance did a country actually, even if it tested, ultimately decide to deploy weapons as operational weapons systems. That remains the case to date.
Thank you so much. What were some of the first documents in the United States that you uncovered for your book on the use of radiological weapons, and who was involved, and what did these weapons look like?
So perhaps the most interesting, I mean, there are lots of fascinating things that we uncovered, and I think the story that Hannah may tell later about the Egyptian flirtation with radiological weapons merits a screen script. But if there was another kind of reason for us to make sure that in our contract with Stanford University Press for the book, and by the way, I forgot to say, there are flyers for the book on the table. It sells for under 20 francs, so I encourage you to order a copy. But if there were another thing that I would make sure that we had in our contract, it was the screen rights having to do with the relationship between science fiction and military innovation. And I say that because in response to Christina's question, that while you had in May of 1941 highly classified documents detailing the Uranium Committee's recommendations with respect to the use of the atom. This was an Academy of Sciences committee, which identified 3 different kinds of atomic usage. The first of which was radioactive poisons, essentially. The others having to do with, I think, naval propulsion, and then what we would know today as an atomic bomb. What was so interesting is that in that same month, in the science fiction journal, Astounding Science Fiction, there was an article by a very well-known, certainly subsequently well-known author by the name of Robert Heinlein, who wrote under a pseudonym in this particular instance a story called Solution Unsatisfactory. And in that particular story, which was published before the US actually entered the Second World War, he talks about scientists in the US government during the war, which had yet to involve directly the United States, developing something that they referred to as death dust. And he depicts this challenge between trying to produce death dust in large quantities and promoting an arms race, and also perhaps the knowledge of what this deadly substance was, leading to some kind of a more peaceful world that would adopt restrictions on the production of this particular material. So there was these 2 parallel developments, that in the popular culture, in science fiction, and then the scientists who were also focusing on the issue. The last point I'll make with reference to your point, though, is that we know that both Heinlein and his publisher, a man by the name of Campbell, who had a physics degree from Duke, which entitled him to speculate with some, I think, knowledge about developments in the nuclear sector. Both of them were very much involved in discussions with actual nuclear scientists, particularly those working with Lawrence at the University of California, Berkeley. And while we have no evidence to suggest that the science fiction authors or publishers directly impacted on US government thinking, we do know that a number of Manhattan Project scientists were familiar with their work. And Edward Teller was one who had actually subsequently indicated that he had read this story by Heinlein. So there is this interesting connection between that which was classified and that which was being written with considerable accuracy about the same subject.
Thank you so much. But would you still argue that the primary reason that the U.S. pursued radiological weapons was for their fear that Nazi Germany was also doing the same?
Sure. I mean, that's a kind of a different question. I mean, there was the question of, you know, what was possible, and you had both in the U.S. and then you had the Maud Committee report in the UK at about the same time, looking at different things that might be done in the nuclear sector. But the U.S. was aware of research that was underway in Nazi Germany, and there was a concern that the byproducts of the operation of what was seen as a possible nuclear reactor could be used by the Germans to produce something like radiological dispersal devices. And in fact, it was taken quite seriously to the point that there was an operation known as Operation Peppermint, which was designed to help the landing forces in advance of the Normandy invasion prepare for possible defenses against Nazi Germany use of some kind of radiological weapon. So it was a concern, certainly, about what the Germans were doing that was a main driver initially for the U.S.
So much. Thank you. And I haven't forgotten you, Dr. Notte. How did you get involved in the book project? We already heard a little bit about it, your deep knowledge of Arabic and Russian as well. But what did you specifically focus on, and did you have some difficulty with your research?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think Dr. Potter already noted I was sort of the last to join the team in this 10 years effort to write the story on radiological weapons programs. I believe it was 2020 when I joined the team to look at the Egyptian and Iraqi, I don't want to say programs, because I'll explain in a moment that the Egyptians didn't really have a program as such, but to look at the Egyptian and Iraqi efforts. It was difficult to research because while on the US side, Dr. Potter just spoke about the variety of documents and evidence that he had access to write that story. For the non-US cases, it was harder to piece together the story. Our colleague, Sarah Bidgood, who can't be with us here today, she took the lead on the Soviet case study, and even she had, comparatively good access to some of the material that she needed to write that story, because the Bologna Foundation has done some great reporting on the subject. And there's also the Rosatom digital archive on the atomic projects. So there was a fair amount of primary source evidence there. Turning to Iraq and Egypt, it was a lot harder. Let me start with the Iraqi case study. It's actually the most recent case study that we look at in the book, because the Iraqis tested radiological weapons in the desert in the late 1980s, so quite late. And because we had UNSCAM going into Iraq in the 1990s and an IAEA action team to uncover the whole scope of WMD programs pursued under Saddam, we have some documentary evidence from that. We also actually have a progress report drawn up by the Iraqis in, I believe, 1988, where they were reviewing how the program was going. But other than that, relatively little primary source evidence. The Egyptian story was the hardest to put together. So I'll say a bit more about the Egyptian case, perhaps a bit later, but it was a flirtation with radiological weapons under President Nasser in the early 60s. And what we essentially had to rely on was depositions and material from a court case that happened in Switzerland, because the primary individual who claims to have led the Egyptian effort, a German scientist by the name of Otto Joklik, he was put on trial in Switzerland, and in that process he divulged quite a lot of information about what he was trying to accomplish. But there's no primary source evidence from the Egyptian side, so it was really a matter of looking at that court case, looking at what the Israeli government was saying on the matter at the time, some declassified US intelligence documents, and then a lot of media reporting. So yeah, it felt at times a bit like putting together a spy novel.
Thank you. And I had as a specific question Switzerland's role, and I'm happy that you're going to perhaps talk a little bit about that in more detail. But I also was wondering about some of the notable instances of espionage. Were there notable instances of espionage related to the acquisition of the dissemination of knowledge about radiological weapons that you uncovered?
I can actually take those two questions together because the role of Switzerland in the Egyptian story and the role of espionage are very much connected. So let me go back a little bit. So we have this individual by the name of Otto Jocklick, who's a German scientist who shows up in Egypt in the early 1960s, among other German scientists who were helping the Egyptian missile program, rocket program. And we have this individual claiming that he was in Cairo for about 6 months to work on a project called Project IBIS, which was meant to entail the development of artillery shells filled with radioactive isotopes, and later was supposed to evolve into the development of radiological warheads for Egypt's missile force. So this individual then actually defects to Israel. We don't know precisely why. He claims that he had moral qualms about the work that he was conducting in Cairo and therefore flew to Israel. It's also possible that he was intimidated because at the time, the Mossad was engaged in something called Operation Damocles, which was an operation to dissuade German scientists from supporting the various Egyptian efforts on unconventional weapons. In any case, Otto Jocklick goes to Israel. He's interviewed by Isser Harel, who's the chief of the Mossad, and by then Foreign Minister Golda Meir, who think that his accusations are credible. There's then this whole story about how there's disagreements within the Israeli intelligence community as to whether Otto Jocklick is actually a credible source or is just making all of this up. But in any case, Isser Harel, who leads the Mossad at the time, thinks that Otto Jocklick could be useful. He could be sent back to Europe and be used to dissuade other German scientists from helping the Egyptians. So he's given a handler by the name of Josef Bengal, and the two fly back to Europe and show up in Basel, which gets us to Switzerland. And they set up various meetings with scientists to essentially intimidate and coerce them, come up with some sorts of threats to say, you shouldn't go and work for the Egyptians. They set up one such meeting with a lady called Heidi Görke in March of 1963. Her father was working on the Egyptian rocket program. What Otto Jocklick and Josef Bengal don't know is that meeting is under surveillance by the Swiss police. And the two get arrested and put on trial and on charges of attempted coercion and illegal activities on behalf of a foreign government. And they're put on trial in Switzerland. They're sentenced, I think, to 2 months in prison, some sort of nominal sentence, and then expelled from Switzerland. So that's the sort of espionage element to the Egyptian story. That's where Switzerland comes in. And because the trial received global media attention at a time, there's also a lot of sort of journalistic commentary around the Egyptian case that was useful for the story. I'll say one last thing about espionage in the context of this book. It also plays a role regarding the Soviet program that we haven't yet talked about, where we have evidence that some British spies who were working for the Soviet Union at the time, Klaus Fuchs and Alan Nunn may have passed intelligence to the Soviet Union that could have been relevant regarding radiological weapons. They were certainly passing on intelligence related to the nuclear weapons programs, but some of that information may have been pertinent to radiological weapons as well.
Thank you. And the book does indeed read like a spy novel. So I do encourage you to grab one of the flyers. I wanted to ask you a little bit more on Egypt and why did the Egyptians want radiological weapons and who was specifically responsible for their conception?
So again, we're quite cautious in the book not to over-exaggerate the Egyptian effort. You know, we call it a flirtation. It wasn't a program. It was the one case in our book where an individual seems to have been very critical for this pursuit, this individual, Otto Jocklick. Now, why is it conceivable that he was running with this for some period and sort of getting away with conducting this research and perhaps even had some buy-in from senior leadership? Well, it's because Egypt under Jamal Abdel Nasser was pursuing other unconventional weapons at the time. This is Egypt in the early 1960s, at a time when the Egyptians grew increasingly concerned over what they perceived to be Israel's growing qualitative military edge over Egypt in the region. The Israelis had just revealed their Dimona reactor in the Negev desert, I believe in December 1960. The Egyptian Air Force had appeared very weak in the Suez War of 1956. So there was this concern over on the Egyptian side. They were investing in their missile program, but we don't have evidence to say that radiological weapons per se were being singled out or prioritized by the Egyptian leadership in any particular fashion. What Yoklik claims during the trial is that he was under the direct command of the Egyptian Air Force, which was in the lead on this effort, and that only a handful of individuals on the Egyptian side had knowledge of this effort and sort of knew about it, that it was highly compartmentalized. But even that information is sort of difficult to vet against other evidence.
Thank you so much. And then for one other point I wanted to ask you is, why did the Iraqis want radiological weapons programs, and who was in the lead in Iraq? And how did this evidence come to light, the Iraq radiation program?
So the Iraqi program is a very different story from the Egyptian, because in the case of Egypt, it just appeared that there was a concern over Egypt's status in the region, over what the Israelis were doing, and a sort of desire to both match and deter the Israelis. But there's no evidence that there were any concrete concepts of deterrence or operational concepts related to radiological weapons. If they exist, then they're just not available in the source record. With the Iraqis, it was very different. They wanted radiological weapons for a concrete purpose, as an area denial weapon at a specific stage in the war with Iran, which had started in 1980. So by the, I think, mid-1980s, around 1986 or so, we know that efforts started to look into a radiological weapons capacity because they wanted something else. I mean, they were already using chemical weapons in the context of this war, but there was a perceived need to have other tools available to use against Iranian human wave attacks at this particular stage in the war. But again, an individual seems to have been very critical for this effort, Hussein Kamal, who was the head of the MIC, the Military Industrial Corporation. He also became the leader of the Iraqi Atomic Energy Commission, and he happened to be Saddam Hussein's son-in-law. So he was an individual sort of singularly well-placed to pursue this effort. Some sources claim that he became obsessed with the idea of a radiological weapon, though again, it's an individual source claiming it, so we don't know how much to make of it. But we don't know, did he come up with the idea? Did nuclear scientists present him with this idea? Did someone from the chemical weapons enterprise present him with this idea? What we certainly know about Iraq at the time, and to some extent it also relates to Egypt in the early 1960s, is that there was somewhat of a welcoming institutional context for military innovation, for individuals to step forward and present some sort of idea to the establishment, and then resources would be freed up for that idea to be pursued. And also a context in which individuals stepping forward to say that perhaps this was not a good idea, that perhaps this was technologically not feasible, was also not given. I've spoken to some of the Iraqi nuclear scientists who actually had no knowledge of this effort, but they sort of shared with me their impression that under Saddam during this time, if individuals had felt that this radiological weapons program wasn't really going to go anywhere, and indeed the tests that they conducted in 1987 were not satisfactory, then no one would have dared to step forward to Hussein Kamal and say so. So once the idea was in motion, they ran with it. In terms of how the effort was uncovered, it's very interesting. It came to light in the context of the 1990s, as I mentioned, UNSCAM and IAEA action team going into Iraq. Though the tests happened in 1987, and 3 prototype bombs were tested, and subsequently the Iraqis gave up the effort. There are several reasons for why it took some time for this effort to come to light. First of all, there was Iraqi deception vis-à-vis the inspectors, not being very forthcoming and volunteering information in the early 1990s. I suppose that's something that's fairly well documented in other scholarship on the other WMD programs. There was also there was not any foreign intelligence on what the Iraqis had done. So if you look at US intelligence assessments at the time, in the late 1980s or early 90s, they don't indicate that the Iraqis might have been experimenting with a radiological weapon. Of course, by the time the inspectors went in, it was also very hard to find any physical evidence from the tests that had occurred. And I will also say that there was such an overwhelming concern with the chemical weapons program, with the bioweapons program, that inspectors just had their hands full, you know. And I spoke with, I just wrote down a quote here this morning. I spoke with Gustavus Lauvinen, who was at that time the chief of staff to the executive chairman of UNSCAM. And he said to me, given the size of what we conducted in Iraq at the time, it was almost impossible to find out things held clandestinely. You had to be lucky to find evidence of something you did not know exists. And so it wasn't until Hussein Kamal, this critical individual, defected to Jordan from Iraq in 1995, that the Iraqi government decided to come forward with some of the evidence, because they were basically worried that Hussein Kamal would sort of shape the narrative, divulge information, and they wanted to beat him to the punch. And so there were some inconsistencies in the Iraqi chemical weapons declarations related to munitions, which probably had to do with the radiological weapons program, because some of the munitions for the chemical program were supposed to be repurposed for the radiological weapons program. So there were inconsistencies in the declarations. The Iraqis probably knew that the inspectors would probe that. And so that's when the Iraqis come forward and divulge some information to the inspectors. But we don't know whether it would have happened had Hussein Kamal not fled the country and gone to Jordan.
So much. I'm going to now pass the floor back to Dr. Potter. What role did the scientific advancements and breakthroughs play in the development of radiological weapons throughout history, and why couldn't radiological weapons deliver what they promised?
Thanks. Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to listen to Hannah expound on the details of the Egyptian and Iraqi cases. Before I respond to your question, I think because initially we had planned to kind of lay out in perhaps a little bit more detail the 2 major programs in the radiological weapons sector, which we haven't really addressed in any detail. And I'm not going to go into detail, but I think it's very important to appreciate that both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, you had a major investment in the development of radiological weapons. You had very extensive testing of radiological weapons, and that these developments continued for an extended period of time. It's also important to understand both the role of scientists, you kind of alluded to the scientists, but there were also very significant bureaucratic political disputes in both particularly in the United States, but also in the Soviet Union, which played a role in both the rise and the subsequent decline of support for these programs. Maybe I'll say just a little bit about the U.S. instance, and Hannah may want to say more about the Russian case. So what was intriguing is that at the end of the war, the organization that was in existence that was most interested in embracing the potential of radiological weapons was the Army Chemical Corps, because chemical weapons had not been used. Everyone was aware of the potential rise in support and the availability of funds for work in the nuclear sector. And so most of the different government players in the defense space were trying to figure out an angle which could generate funding for them going forward. And the Chemical Weapons Corps saw radiological weapons as a potential source of institutional support and funding going forward. So they essentially assumed control of this. And there were then divisions among the scientists. We don't really have time, I think, to go into that at the moment. But there were interesting comments by many of the scientists whose names you would recognize, including Robert Oppenheimer, with respect to the potential and also the liabilities of radiological weapons. By the same token, in the US case, by the mid-1950s, certainly by 1956, it was very clear that radiological weapons did not really have strong institutional support, and they had no support at very high levels of the government, which were crucial in terms of not allowing this potential innovation to actually gain traction and to yield weapons that were deployed. And one reason was that what we refer to and others in the field have talked to is the substitution effect, that once nuclear weapons had been demonstrated, it was very difficult for the proponents of other weapon systems to compete with them. And ultimately, the Chemical Weapons Corps and other proponents of radiological weapons lost out. They lost out for those bureaucratic reasons, but they also lost out for technical reasons. And I don't want to go into much detail here, but it's important to appreciate that different countries, the 5 countries that we've mentioned, pursued different technical approaches to the production of the radioactive material. And so in the US instance, they actually made use of, let me state it differently. The 2 basic approaches had to do with using nuclear waste or basically inserting inert material in a reactor and producing radioisotopes that could be used. But in the US instance, the choice that was selected, which was to basically produce these radioisotopes by using inert material, the same reactors that were being used for that purpose were dedicated plutonium production reactors. And it was decided that it made much more sense from the standpoint of priorities to focus on the production of nuclear weapons. And while in principle you could have built other production facilities, it turned out not to be a winning approach bureaucratically. And it was also seen ultimately as not really serving any of the service's main missions. This was another key element. I mean, did the weapon actually make sense from a cost-effective standpoint for a particular military mission? The Navy, which was interested also in things nuclear, Admiral Rickover, basically wanted nuclear propulsion. And so that was his focus rather than radiological weapons. Hannah can detail the rise and the decline in the Soviet case, but I thought it was important to understand better the gestation of support for radiological weapons in the U.S. case. The fact that there actually was a very substantial testing program, but that ultimately by 1956 it was determined for technical reasons and for the lack of support at the highest levels, and because of the absence of a military mission to phase out the system.
Thank you so much. I didn't know. Did you want to elaborate on that, or should we keep going?
I can say just taking over for my colleague Sarah, who is not here, who took the lead in writing this chapter. So the Soviet pursuit of radiological weapons coincided quite significantly overlap with the U.S. interest in radiological weapons. So it started in 1940 when you have two Soviet physical mathematicians putting forward an idea on paper to the Soviet Bureau of Inventions. And it was a proposal on, quote unquote, the use of uranium as an explosive and poisoning substance. But what happened at that time in 1940 was that effort was dismissed as uninteresting and unfeasible. And things only really started to change in the Soviet Union when the Soviets got wind that the Americans were pursuing a radiological weapon. That's when they became more interested in looking at it themselves, when they had that credible evidence. And that's when they started research on defensive radiological weapons capability. We cannot pinpoint the precise moment at which that work on a defensive capability turned into an offensive program, but we situated sometime around the early 1950s. Like in the US case, the chemical weapons enterprise in the Soviet Union was assigned a key responsibility in looking into the issue and conducting research. And when it came to testing, and the Soviet Union did extensive testing on radiological weapons throughout the 1950s, the Soviet Navy played an important role. So you had tests, which Sarah details to great extent in the book chapter, in Semipalatinsk and near Kapustin Yar in the mid-1950s. I think the Soviets looked at aerial bombs, at cluster munitions, and at warheads for their missiles. But by the end of the 1950s, around 1958, the program sort of petered out. Unlike in the US case, there wasn't a sort of abrupt stop to the program. It seems to have withered away gradually. One thing to note about why that happened in the Soviet Union, and to sort of add to Bill's points about the demise of radiological weapons more generally, and why they did not appear suitable to the military missions that those who came up with the idea had in mind, is the fact that in the Soviet Union there were also a lot of accidents involving those kinds of tests, with injuries and even deaths. Because the handling of those substances was so dangerous. But there are a number of perhaps more important factors that explain why the Soviets abandoned the program in the late 1950s. Just like in our other case studies, they came short in comparison to other weapons that the Soviet Union was pursuing. Perhaps the Soviet Union also lacked what we call slack resources, so available resources to put into different non-conventional weapons programs, and they became especially much more interested in the chemical weapons program in the mid-1950s, and devoted a massive infrastructure to that. So proponents of radiological weapons lost out in that competition. And then perhaps there was also a change in the perceived threat environment, because the US stopped pursuing radiological weapons. So the disinterest on the US side might also have played into the fact that this became less attractive on the Soviet side.
Thank you so much. And indeed, when Hannah speaks, it's like the story comes alive. So thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask you now as well, what are some of the lessons that you have learned across the 5 countries? And I can ask both of you these questions, but basically your 5 case studies, the US, the UK, Egypt, Israel, and the United Kingdom.
I mean, to me, the biggest lesson relates to the shortcomings of radiological weapons. And I think Bill has already given a great account of why these weapons didn't promise or didn't yield what they promised to those who pursued them, and came up short against chemical weapons often as well. So I don't want to sort of add too much to that. Perhaps just one point. on the kinetic warfare bias that we also mentioned in our book, that at least on the US side, there was perhaps a preference in the weapons establishment for weapons resembling bullets or bombs over those that rely on less visible physical properties to do the killing. This is something that Frank Smith has termed the kinetic warfare bias. That might also have been at play here, in addition to the substitution effect that Bill already noted. So yeah, the fact that they didn't deliver what they promised is perhaps the biggest story across the cases, because, you know, we looked at 5 cases, 3 tested, none of these countries ever deployed or used radiological weapons in their arsenals. But another sort of lesson across the 5 cases is the role of individuals. You know, all of these countries looked at radiological weapons because of their perceived threat environment. They thought they needed that kind of weapon. But individuals were key to running with the idea and generating initial resources and not just budgetary support, but also political support. Now, on the US side, those individuals tended to be scientists. In the case of the Soviet Union and Iraq, those tended to be government officials. And, you know, I spoke about Hussein Kamal. I mean, he was really singularly important in the Iraqi case, as was Otto Joklik on the Egyptian side. So the role of sort of bureaucratic politics, institutional and individual advocates, and then what happens to these programs when these advocates step away from the scene, I think that's another theme that emerges across the cases.
One other item which I think is intriguing, and that has to do with intelligence failures. If you look at the US in particular, as best we can tell, there was absolutely no awareness whatsoever of what was being done at various points in time in the Soviet Union, certainly before the end of the Second World War and into the late 1940s. And we've seen declassified intelligence reports which are dismissive of the possibility of any work in the Soviet Union in this sphere. That's significant because had they been aware of Soviet interest and investment, it's quite conceivable that they might have allocated more resources and been more inclined to pursue work in that domain. As best we can tell also, the United States was neither interested nor aware of the interest that the Brits had invested in this area. And by the same token, other than perhaps those agents working for the Soviet Union in Britain, there appeared to be no recognition in the UK about the work that was being done in the Soviet Union. And so in most instances, countries seem to have discovered the idea independently. The Soviets is a more complicated case because there was an awareness by some Soviet scientists in the early 1940s, but there was no apparent institutional support for them at that period in time. But they then were subsequently aware of the interest that the Americans had in the program, and so they decided also that that made sense to invest with. But it is an area where intelligence is very hard to come by because of the nature of what we're talking about, the production of radioactive isotopes. So looking toward the future, I think that's going to be a real challenge. And at some point in time, probably sooner rather than later, we probably want to talk a little bit about the future because we want to leave time for questions as well from the audience.
Yes, and that leads me to the next question for you. Do you believe that Russia's war against Ukraine and the attendant escalation in great power competition have eroded the taboo of using nuclear weapons and undermined the non-proliferation regime?
The short answer to that is yes, but let me make this more specific to the case of radiological weapons. As best we can tell, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Ukraine ever had any interest in radiological weapons, although during the Soviet period, there were actually tests that were conducted in what is Ukraine today. But during the lead up to the Soviet invasion and during the first days of the Soviet invasion, there were all kinds of fabricated accounts of alleged Ukrainian work in the sphere of radiological weapons for a variety of purposes. We can speculate the degree to which these were driven by domestic considerations and other considerations. This became particularly acute or pronounced shortly after the war began, when Russia attacked and seized the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and you saw numerous accounts in the Russian press alleging that Chernobyl was a site of Ukrainian radiological weapons production because of the background radiation that would, basically confuse anybody who might be investigating this. Then there were also explanations of a similar sort made with respect to Zaporizhia. There was also a charge that a nuclear research facility in Kharkov, which previously had housed highly enriched uranium, was a center of Ukrainian radiological weapons work. As best we can tell, these are all fabrications, but there is a long list, and a colleague of mine and I published a piece in the spring of 2022, which chronicles all of these assertions. One actually had the individual provided a citation. I would have regarded it as complimentary, since he took stuff from our book relating to Robert Heinlein, the science fiction dimension, and radiological weapons. But by and large, these were all kind of fabrications. And they subsided by the summer of 2022. But what became more disturbing in the fall of 22 was that you had not only essentially unknown or little known media parties making these claims, but you found the most senior Russian figures. Defense Minister Shoigu, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and if I'm not mistaken, on October 26, President Putin himself also essentially making the same charges about Ukrainian activities in the radiological weapons sphere. And there was even a communication sent by the Russian ambassador in at the United Nations to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council with considerable specificity about where this work was supposed to be taking place. And that was, I think, a tactical mistake, because it enabled then Ukraine to ask the IAEA to inspect those facilities, which they did, and in fact determined that there was no such work that was underway. So I think it's most unfortunate. I think it is part of the kind of saber rattling which also erodes norms against both nuclear weapons use, but also is detrimental in terms of radiological weapons. And what I worry about most, and I think there may be some disagreement among my team in this regard, but I think it would be surprising if Ukraine, which, as I mentioned, by all accounts, has never displayed any interest in the pursuit of radiological weapons, was not to at least give some attention to the potential, because Russia has focused so much attention on the subject itself. And I fear that other countries may also choose to do so, which I think is most disturbing. And I think it's in that context that I want to applaud in particular the initiative that Ambassador Turner in the United States has initiated to revisit, and I emphasize to revisit, an initiative to prohibit the production, stockpiling, and use. I'm talking about first there was an initiative in 1979 when there was actually a, somewhat ironically perhaps today, a US-Soviet draft convention on the prohibition of radiological weapons that was considered initially at the committee on Disarmament, the predecessor of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. And that particular initiative stayed on the books for a very long period of time, I think actually until 1992, if I'm not mistaken. It foundered for a variety of reasons having to do with scope and definition, and then you also had the Israeli attack on the Osiris reactor. But it was something that, for a variety of reasons, both the Soviet Union and the United States wished to support. So I cite that case because I think it's relevant to the more recent initiative that was launched at the First Committee of the United Nations this fall, which ultimately led to a resolution that was overwhelmingly supported. My recollection was 159 to 5 with 13 abstentions. I think the 5 naysayers were Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Belarus. I thought I said those 5. China, interestingly, was simply abstained, but it was a very, very substantial degree of support for this U.S. initiative. And there was also a mandate for this then to be considered at the Conference on Disarmament, which is a tall task given the consensus decision-making manner in which the Conference on Disarmament works and the lack of much headway since 1996 and even adopting a program of work. But I think it has some potential. And I thought maybe if Ambassador Turner wished, he could say a word or two, if the spirit moves you, Bruce, on U.S. thinking about this particular initiative. And I want to really congratulate the U.S. government because it certainly doesn't hurt in terms of the book sales to have what had started out as a historical study now take on a very real-life political activity here in Geneva, among other places.
So I just wanted to add one more thing. Will you encourage Washington to support this initiative, especially about the dangers of radiological weapons? And do you think there should be a committee set up to do this? And is this actually the purpose of your visit here in Geneva, or is this off the record?
No. It's not off the record. I'm here in Geneva mainly because we are holding our regular Honesty NPT diplomatic workshop beginning tomorrow. And so this was a marvelous target of opportunity, and I'm grateful to the GCSP for making it possible for Hannah and me to present our findings. I think Ambassador Turner can speak more to the potential for perhaps parallel activities that could be undertaken, including a group of government experts. I know some countries have seen this as desirable. I would guess that such a group would probably also mirror some of the recommendations that we've made in our study. I mean, it'd be marvelous if the conference could actually take this issue under its belt and address what had in the past been an issue of great interest. But here I really defer to the ambassador for taking the pulse here about what could be done in this regard.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Turner. Would you like to take the podium, and we can give you one of our mics? Here, you can have mine. Here.
I don't know if I need a podium for this, but I also had a question for you. I was very interested in your remark about possible Ukrainian interest in developing radiological weapons as a sort of a theoretical construct, because if indeed history shows that the United States, the Soviet Union, these other countries never did develop radiological weapons, what would be the advantage, theoretical advantage to Ukraine of developing such a radiological weapon?
You want me to answer that first?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask you. So what I want to be absolutely clear on, and particularly since this is being recorded and there are parties that I can't see who may be listening to this, there's absolutely no evidence that we have to suggest that Ukraine has given any consideration to radiological weapons. There are all kinds of impediments that they would have to overcome, as would any country, and you have to ask what are the military missions that would be appropriate. But I think it is fair to say that given the repeated accusations that the Russians have made about Ukrainian activities in this domain, and made at the highest levels, that it would be naive to assume that that no attention is being at least given to a assessment of the virtues and liabilities, particularly if one thinks of these not as not for purposes of war fighting, because I think there are severe limitations, but conceivably more in terms of instilling fear and terror, more along the lines of a non-state actor. That's what I worry about. And it's not just Ukraine. I mean, one of the problems and one of the reasons why I think it's so important that you have this initiative before the CD at the moment is that currently there are no international conventions. There is no international law with respect to the use of radiological weapons. And so some countries that might, assuming the countries, in fact are impacted, as I think to some extent they are, by international conventions and international law, if they in fact believe that they are at risk, if they have less confidence in security assurances today, then they may look at other forms of non-conventional weapons, and one would have to include radiological weapons in that mix. And so that's, I think, a reason why the international community should give more attention to a prohibition on radiological weapons use.
My only comment to that would be to say that, I don't know how much, I'm not an expert in how much it would cost to develop such a radiological weapon. So that's would be an important question. And at this time, I think the Ukrainians' needs are very much based on conventional munitions and what they need in that respect, rather than developing new kinds of weapon systems. And as far as, the Russian allegations, this is their modus operandi. It's part of their propaganda effort and to discredit the Ukrainians in every way possible. Just as a factual matter, just to note that I don't have the exact figures for the UN First Committee resolution on it, but by the time it got to the UNGA, it was 164 to 4 to 13 abstentions. So we got a number of those who abstained in UN First Committee actually voted for it, and the number of countries opposing actually dropped from 5 to 4.
Well, the one that I forgot, I think, was Syria. It was Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Syria. Do you know which country?
Ashley, I don't know. I don't think I have that figure. It's possible that Belarus dropped its opposition because they have traditionally been a supporter of work in this area, and they've had initiatives in the past on this. But in any event, our initiative is focused on state use only. As Bill rightly said, this is an issue that's been on the agenda since the very beginning of arms control. So, we talk about CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. So it's a distinct category for which there is no convention. And we focused on state use for several reasons. One, because we're actually fairly confident that states are not doing this, which would make it somewhat easier to develop a prohibition for. We avoided getting into the areas of radiological isotopes, how radiological materials are produced, because I think this is where the talks got bogged down in the past, and we want to avoid an overcomplicated negotiating process. And the third factor was we thought this would be a way to give the Conference on Disarmament an easy win, if you will, something that it could usefully work on. Right now, we've been stalemated for over 20 years. Nobody seems to be able to agree to do anything. And by narrowing the scope and focusing on a weapon system that, to our knowledge, no one is actively developing, we thought it might be a productive thing to do, which would also get the CD working again. To do that, we have to have a program of work, which by the end of the week, we may know whether we have one or not. And if there is a program of work, the agenda items that the Conference on Disarmament discusses are pretty standard. But on the basis of a program of work, you can set up subsidiary bodies that then begin to look into these issues. And we're in the process back in Washington of developing a text that we could eventually put on the table to have discussions on this issue.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for answering one of the questions on my list is how to stop the paralysis in the Conference on Disarmament. And I think you've done a great job to give us hope there. So thank you so much. I'm now we're going to have some final comments at the end from both of you, but I'm now going to open the floor, thank you, to questions. So please, if you want to introduce yourself, you can. That would be very nice, but there's no need to. Please do ask us short questions, and if you have a statement, please keep it short. So the floor is yours. Please begin. Whoever would like to start. Yes, please go ahead. You don't need a mic. I don't need a mic. We're going to open the floor now and everyone can hear everyone.
Wonderful. Catherine Wong. I'm a fellow at GCSP and was with many years at the International Committee of the Red Cross. And with that in mind, I think you will not be surprised by my question. And it is whether existing law might already impose limits on the development and use of radiological weapons. And I'm thinking in particular of international humanitarian law, laws and customs of war, which prohibit the use of means and methods of warfare that are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilian objects without distinction. In other words, of indiscriminate means of warfare, knowing that radiological material that is dispersed by a radiological bomb, you lose control over it, the same way you lose control over biological weapons, chemical weapons, etc. This is why, fundamentally, biological and chemical weapons have been prohibited. Also, the rules that aim to protect the natural environment from widespread and long-term damage, given the damages caused. I'm just flagging this because, of course, there are very laudable efforts now, perhaps, in the pipeline with this UNGA resolution and eventually the CD's work to prohibit radiological weapons. But we already have a foundation there in the international law framework. To do so is what I would submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who would like to begin?
Okay, let me, first of all, I'm not an international lawyer and I don't want to misspeak. I think, one possible response to your very good question, and it certainly bears more attention, is that to some extent, it probably depends on the kind of radiological weapon that one is developing. We found that in most instances, the military was primarily interested in radiological weapons for purposes of area denial. And so, one I could imagine at least could make the argument that this would be deployed in a fashion which was designed to prevent enemy troops from occupying, particular territory. It turns out to be a much more difficult technical challenge than science fiction authors and a number of scientists initially assumed, because of the need to produce the kind of radioisotope with the right half-life. And that is not a simple matter, and it also becomes complicated and expensive because of the degrading of the radioisotopes over time. So you would have to be producing these presumably, constantly. And so I think that is at least a partial response to your question, but it's one that I am not really able to answer with more authority. This, I assume, is something that probably Ambassador Turner has encountered also in his discussions. The literature with which I'm familiar usually reports that there is no international convention and no international law that pertains specifically to radiological weapons use. If that literature needs to be corrected, I would be pleased to see that done, but I can't say more to your point. Hannah, do you have any? Yeah. Maybe, okay, I'm sorry. I was going to add just one other thing, which I think is really important in the context of the discussion about, Ukraine. I'm hopeful that we will see some headway at the CD on some kind of legally binding prohibition. But I think what's also very important to derive from our case studies is not only the difficulties that states encountered in the past, but also it's the difficulties of different sorts, which I think needs to be appreciated, which may make radiological weapons less desirable than they appear at first glance. And so we see one of the contributions that academics like ourselves can make is to share that information with other parties and other policymakers. I do think, however, it's also important for national governments to give more thought to the potential impact of future radiological weapons programs were they to evolve on deterrence. Because my interactions, at least, and I only work in the open domain, I don't have a clearance and I don't pretend to know what is classified, although I would say as an aside, my experience has been that there is no positive correlation between that which is classified and that which is important or accurate. So that's another point here. Now I've lost my train of thought here.
Deterrence.
Pardon? Oh, on deterrence. I've been struck in my conversations with government parties, the absence of consideration of deterring radiological weapons. Let's go back to the case of the DPRK, which is what gave rise to our study, in the first place. If, for whatever reason, the DPRK were to develop and to employ radiological weapons, how would we respond? Would we regard the weapon as a nuclear weapon? It's a non-conventional weapon, but it's unclear how it would be defined and what then would be, the response. One of the other problems here, and this is something that we struggled with earlier on in the study, was how much attention do you want to give to deterrence of this kind of a weapon? Because might you also encourage states to, in fact, focus more on it? This became somewhat moot after the Russian hype about what was being done allegedly in Ukraine. But I'm surprised by and I really applaud, the U.S. government for deciding to focus on the issue at this time. But it's one that has not received much attention. And I've been so surprised. And I've talked to individuals, I won't name them, but you might guess who they are, who are seen as the institutional memory, for example, of U.S. arms control, former directors of major national laboratories, colleagues in other governments whose countries we know pursued radiological weapons, who are totally unaware of what their countries did in this domain. So there's just a big gap in knowledge. And so hopefully we've contributed a little bit to a better understanding of what's transpired in the past.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Ambassador Grimminger.
Well, first, thank you very much for your
presentations, for your answers. I think this was fascinating to listen to the two of you. I was also coming back to what you started out with, and that is this image of DPRK soldiers. So you selected these 5 country cases. Is this because there are these 5 cases and no others, or have other countries also, thought about or started developing programs? That would be my, and then, of course, I would be particularly interested if, DPRK, ever, kind of seriously thought about it. And perhaps, forgive my ignorance, could you say a few words on the risks of non-state use of this technology, or is this simply too complicated for non-state actors to use?
Okay. First, let me deal with your second question first. It's very difficult for me, and I think for most parties who have focused some attention on nuclear violence at the non-state level, to explain why we have not seen incidents in the past involving what in the colloquial kind of terminology is a dirty bomb. The material is available in many different forms. And it could be as primitive as taking a stick of dynamite and matching it to some, orphan sources that were discovered, radioactive sources which are not accounted for, if you were prepared to, endanger yourself. I think to a large extent, luck explains why this has not been the case in the past. But it also is a question of the motivations of non-state actors. And because of the manner in which radiation kills, particularly in the absence of a nuclear detonation, it may not be the kind of effect that terrorists would desire. But it's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer to it. I think we all kind of struggle to understand why, fortunately, we haven't experienced that kind of disaster, which I think most people would not as a weapon of mass destruction, but one of mass disruption. With respect to the first question, we are not aware of any other countries that either had dedicated programs or, in the case of Egypt, flirted with the acquisition of radiological material for the purposes of military use. My own hunch, and it is nothing more than a supposition, is that most countries that actively pursued nuclear weapons programs at one point of time or another probably gave some thought to the possibility of radiological weapons. We've sought to explore this, particularly with countries where we have more transparency, say the case of France, or perhaps in India or Pakistan. But I have not been able to get any traction whatsoever. There was one reference, I believe, in the press having to do with the Egyptian case, where India was referenced. I think this was an article about whatever it was called, like radiological garbage or something. There was some op-ed or article in the New York Times. But I think that was just, I don't see any foundation for that assertion. What is interesting, though, Thomas, is that as best we can tell, the substitution effect really does pertain. And if countries in the past that subsequently acquired nuclear weapons were interested in radiological weapons, they appear to have lost that interest once they acquired nuclear weapons. So anybody in the audience, you know, in person, online, if you have information that would suggest other countries, you know, we're already looking for a second edition for the book.
Okay.
And we'd be you know, quite interested in this. So I would be surprised if there weren't some, but I have absolutely no evidence of that. Maybe Hannah.
We do note some very episodic allegations in the book. I think the Israelis conducted civil defense exercises, I think around a decade ago, 2011, because of a worry of Iranian radiological weapons. But when probing this issue further, we did not find anything more. And there's also some statements by President Nasser of Egypt at the time that could be read as suggesting that he was worried about Israeli radiological weapons. But again, besides these very sporadic accusations, we haven't found anything further on those cases.
Thank you so much. After reading the book, I had just one comment as well. One of the countries I think you highlighted very well, the problems that it had these tests, or they're trying to do radioactive radiological weapons, that the impact it had on society and human security and as an environmental threat. And I saw that in the chapter on the Soviet Union. So I thought that would be for the next edition to really highlight also what these tests do to societies and people and the impact it has on the health and human security of people. I think that would be really good. There was a book actually by Howard Hu, who's a public health expert, who highlighted all these testings and what impact it had on human security and health, public health. So I think that's a huge issue because you have a lot of power, so you could also underline that part of the story.
It's nice to hear. I think it's
I also have to do one more comment. We had a wonderful Geneva Security Debate with Sandeep Waslekar, who wrote a book, The War to End All Wars, hoping to talk about how to eliminate arms in general and weapons of mass destruction in particular. Is there a hope? Do you think humanity will ever go down that road? And what can we here do in International Geneva to make that happen? I have to ask that question.
Go ahead, Hannah. You're never at a loss for words.
I'm going to speak my mind and say what I think at the moment. I think in such a highly adversarial international environment that we have to, I think, really focus on preserving what we have and things not getting worse. So when it comes to arms control, non-proliferation, or disarmament and what could be usefully done at the moment, I'll name perhaps 3 things. I think it's absolutely vital that the central limits under the New START Treaty are being preserved, which appears to be the case up to this point, though Russia has suspended participation in the treaty. From what we learn, the limits are still in place. The treaty expires in 2026. I think if we lose those limits, then a nuclear arms race becomes much more likely. So that's the first thing. The second thing is nuclear risk reduction, where a lot of work is now being conducted in the P5 format, which I believe just met under Russian chairmanship in Saudi Arabia, to make sure that we have some guardrails in this more dangerous international environment, and then try to forge consensus on issues that are less adversarial. And this is where the CD and the work on the radiological weapons prohibition comes in.
And let me maybe my closing remarks. I'm sensitive to the time here. I think it's one really important to remember, and it's hard to recall this given the current state of U.S.-Russian relations, that for much of the Cold War and subsequently, the United States and the Russian Federation worked very closely on issues of nuclear non-proliferation, even during some of the more frigid moments of the Cold War. We were able to insulate that sphere of cooperation from all of the other problems that we confronted. And a good example of that was this draft joint convention that was submitted in 1979 to the Committee on Disarmament. And so I think it is good to recall that this kind of cooperation was possible in the past, that there were a perception of shared interests, notwithstanding all kinds of other differences. And it's interesting also, and this is little noted, and I don't think it's even referenced in the book, but I'm aware of interest that was shown on the part of several members of the P5 after 2015 about perhaps having a discussion among the P5 about some kind of a convention dealing with the prohibition of radiological weapons, in part because it was seen as something that might be brought to what was then thought to be a 2020 NPT review conference, where the nuclear weapon states could also demonstrate that there was some progress that they were taking in the nuclear sector, broadly defined. And so I think it's interesting that you had at least 4 of the 5 NPT recognized nuclear weapon states not opposed to this initiative. And so I would encourage those of you who are representatives of the P5 to, in fact, consider if you're not able to make headway at the CD, or even if you are able to make headway at the CD, that this is an issue that also perhaps merits discussion in this smaller forum. So, and the teaser here, and we're not going to answer the question, but I talked a little bit about science fiction and the US case, but there's also a Soviet counterpart. And so if you're curious about that, you want to read chapter 2 of the book, and there are flyers again out there if you want to pick them up before you depart. So thank you all for tolerating us for the past hour and a half.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter, Dr. Notte. Thank you for coming, for making the trip to see us. I would also like to thank our director for his excellent introductory remarks. I would like to thank all of you who have attended. Especially would like to thank Ines Becale for her help in organizing this event, Florent Gollet for keeping us in the digital world as well. This has been the 23rd Geneva Security Debate. We already have a couple more in the pipeline, but the next GCSP event will be on the 21st of March. Well, we will conduct the European launch of the Global Terrorism Index. So I welcome you all to come back for that. In the meantime, I wish you a very good afternoon, and I give you all a round of applause for being here with us today.